Next up, publicly listed exchange Coinbase continues to battle allegations from the U.S. securities regulator, which has accused the company of exposing users to what the SEC alleges are unregistered securities. A security, whether registered or not, is essentially a contract with obligations laid out and defined in at least basic terms. And that is the crux of Coinbase's argument for why the SEC is in the wrong here. Quote, because no such obligations are carried in the transactions over Coinbase's secondary market exchange, and because the value that Coinbase purchasers receive through these transactions adheres to the thing bought and traded rather than in the business that generated them, the transactions are not securities transactions, end quote. This is a somewhat controversial take, just because, again, in the world of cryptocurrency, there's a lot of questions about what really is a security as it relates to the Howey test. Zach, I'm going to throw this one to you first. Kind of what's your read on this argument? Is this a strong argument for them?
I think it's a very interesting legal tack. I think what you laid out, right, is that tokens don't guarantee an ownership stake in the projects that ostensibly launch them, right? They exist, they do their thing. There's no public disclosure requirements in terms of how these alleged securities would disclose that information to investors. So Coinbase is saying, hey, this isn't what you think it is. It does not exist within the existing purview, and you've failed to establish clear rulemaking and instead have chosen enforcement. So that I think that's honestly the crux of the argument, and is an interesting argument. It's going to be an interesting one to advance through the courts and to see if judges are sympathetic to this argument and whether or not the U.S. securities regulators have done their due diligence in trying to establish a framework for what these other things will be regulated as. Gary Gensler obviously has maintained that just because it's a new technology doesn't mean it's not going to be covered by existing securities laws. And Coinbase here is saying, no, that entire premise is wrong and faulty. And how that's all going to get arbitrated in court is going to be really fascinating. But yeah, interesting to see this as the initial volley. Wouldn't have necessarily expected that this would have been the approach, but certainly it's a strong statement. That's what I'll say. Will, I'll toss it to you.
Yeah, I actually kind of disagree with Coinbase here. I think that some tokens that they list are not securities, but some of them do fall under the parameters of what a security would be, even if they use different language and wording. Let's take, for example, a governance token. There's a lot of governance tokens listed on Coinbase. You're able to purchase them there. These governance tokens basically have one purpose. That is to govern the function of a DAO that controls the network. And these DAOs purpose is to streamline the network, adopt more users, and generally increase the price of the token. It's like a classic flywheel for these things. And that's been well known for a lot of these projects. You need that. And I actually don't disagree that that's not a good use case for these tokens. I think a governance token can have a good place. But if it quacks like a duck, I think you sort of get the picture, right? Like there could be some problems here. Now, not all the tokens that are listed on Coinbase are that. I think some of them are like that. So I sort of take a different stance. I just think like the Howey test in general is like an old, outdated law and could be changed based on the fact that, things have changed, technology has changed, and there's probably a better way of enforcing regulations than what they're doing currently. The other thing I wanted to bring up was the Coinbase part of this Coinbase article was talking about how they don't like the enforcement actions that have been taken to date. Quote, for years, Coinbase has voluntarily submitted to regulation by multiple overlapping regulatory bodies, has adhered to the public and limited formal guidance from the SEC, senior SEC staff, and the courts about the application of securities laws to its industry. They're basically taking another stance within this argument saying, not only do we think the securities laws are wrong, but we've tried to listen to you guys and you guys have not helped. And therefore, this whole thing should be thrown out in the first place because you're going against your own guidance, which to me is like almost like a 1-2 punch, like coming at them, but also sort of helps them in the back case that, whoever is the judge here disagrees with Coinbase on the securities point, but maybe will agree with them on the fact that the SEC has not been following through with their enforcement actions in like a healthy way. Gonna throw it over to Jen.
Yeah, I think it's a good argument. And Will, to your point, I mean, there are all of these tokens that exist and there is the theoretical use case for it, but then there's how people are actually using that token. And we need to take all of that information into consideration. I think what this highlights is there's the Howey test. It's been used in one way by the SEC for a really long time, but when applied to this industry, maybe there are aspects of the Howey test that are left up for interpretation, which then means the Howey test maybe is not the best tool to use if it can be left up to interpretation. And I think Coinbase's response to this shows just how it can be left to interpretation. Like we're discussing it right now. We're taking different things away from how the Howey test is being applied to different tokens that Coinbase lists. And I think that's a good thing to highlight. Zach?
I guess the big question, like as it relates to Howey, is are tokens the contract of the orange farm, or are tokens the oranges, right? Are tokens an investment contract, or are they just merely something that maybe was initially involved in what may have been an investment contract, and therefore it doesn't necessarily sort of comport with like these existing structures, right? And there's a lot of fuzziness and a lot of questions around that. We've seen a big debate spring up over the launch of Prometheum, which got a special purpose broker-dealer license to trade in digital asset securities, but hasn't really offered much detail into how that would actually work in terms of the investor protection and other things set forth by current regulations. So this conversation is really fascinating. For Coinbase to zig in this direction with their sort of initial statement, it's just going to make for some really interesting viewing, I think, in terms of this brewing SEC crackdown legal/regulatory fight that's obviously being played out on multiple fronts right now. So yeah, another fascinating move to see. I'll toss to Adam.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can wrap up with, I'm comfortable making a prediction here, which is to say that we're going to see this mess continue probably for another 1 or 2 years. And then I think Congress will eventually act in a way that sort of puts this to bed. I agree with the point that like Howey is the tool we have, not the tool that we need. And kind of the all of the deficiencies with that standard in kind of the modern era, you know, close to 100 years later, I think about 90 years later at this point, like that's where the challenge comes into play here, is just that we're using a standard that was designed at a time before we understood a lot of stuff that's like on the basic science level, much less kind of the modern era of technology. And so this will eventually get solved. But in the meantime, it's kind of fertile ground for sort of these power games that these regulatory agencies play, where basically their own sort of self-aggrandizement and their importance to the current narrative. Like if the SEC wasn't focused on tokens right now and they weren't focused on cryptocurrencies, who would care about what they were doing? Who would think about what they were doing? Why would they get more money to do any of the stuff that they're doing? They wouldn't. So this is actually, again, like there's some meaningful incentive in here for them to make the argument that, hey, this is all about us and you better fund us more, right? Give us some more power so that we can protect you from this, even if that's not really the fit. But the beat goes on.
And the beat goes on into the break. We're going to take a break and then we're going to talk about